Okay, good morning everybody. It's nice to be with you guys again. Great office, and it's nice to come by every once in a while and have a chat about what's going on. I'm just going to take a few moments and talk about two or three subjects. Natalie's given me her list, and I'll go over them as quickly as I can, and then throw it open for any quick questions that you might have for a few minutes, so I appreciate your time. This first subject is one that I've given you some handouts, and I'm going to refer to them a bit as we go. So if you could do that in between forks, that might come in handy. I like to take the opportunity whenever I possibly can to talk about this subject because it's one that most of our members are not really all that familiar with, so I think it's important to take a few moments and talk about it. And it's basically, how do you negotiate or how do you deal with the selling commission correctly? If what you are receiving in a given transaction is not what you and your buyer have agreed on, or not what you wanted, what you've negotiated, and how do you deal with it and deal with it properly? Because we see the most amazing creative ways of dealing with this subject, and unfortunately most of them are not right. So we need to take a few moments and go through it, but before I can talk about this subject, it's necessary to take a moment and talk about buyer agency. And I will only talk about it briefly. As you well know, it's a huge subject in itself. But it's really important because you'll see why as we move forward, the value of dealing with a buyer agency contract. In the Code of Ethics and the Standards of Business Practice, which we're all committed to abide by when we become members, Article 5 says this specifically, and it's in your handout as well. But it says, realtors shall ensure that all service agreements with consumers, with the exception of service agreements with buyers, I'll come back to that, are in writing in clear and understandable language expressing the specific terms, conditions, obligations, commitments of the parties to the agreement. So essentially what it's saying is that every time you have a service agreement of any kind whatsoever in our business, with the exception of buyers, it has to be in writing. So whether that is listing, whether that is selling, whether that is leasing, you know, whatever the services you're providing for a fee, that has to be in writing. And when the Code of Ethics and the Standards of Practice were completely redone back in 2005, which they were from the ground up, and I had the opportunity to sit on that for a year and be involved in that nationally, one of the subjects, of course, that came up at that point was buyer agency. And it's very interesting, but for some reason, and unfortunately in my view, the decision was made that buyer agency would not be mandated. And I don't know why. I guess the arguments were many, but I suppose from the point of view that it would be new and it hasn't been done in many areas up until that point, which is, you know, in our area here in BC, if you've been around for a while, buyer agency contracts were never done at one point in time, not that long ago. So it's unfortunate in a way, because had they made buyer agency required, then we'd all be on the same page, and it would just be a standard thing to do, and we wouldn't be worrying about them running to the guy down the street or the gal around the corner and saying, well, I'll work with them because they don't require it, right? So we've got all that kind of a problem going on today. So I'm just going to take a moment and explain a couple of quick reasons why buyer agency is very, very valuable. Why the contracts are very, very valuable. And I think it's really important to recognize a couple of points. If you look under point number 5 in your handout on the, I think it's about the third page here, sorry I didn't number the pages, but when I copied this for you, where it says the buyer agency acknowledges that it is not a conflict or a breach of duty for the buyer or the buyer's brokers to show or introduce properties in which the buyer has an interest to other buyers or have agency relationships with other buyers. And B, it says it's not a conflict or a breach of duty for the buyer, for the buyer's brokerage to have agency relationships with sellers. And the buyer's brokerage will not be required to disclose to the buyer confidential information obtained through a different or any other agency relationship. So why are those three things in there? First of all, let me also say that those exact three things are in your listing contract as well. And why are they there? They're there because if you have more than one client, you are in breach of these things. As you all know, fundamental agency says you must have an undivided loyalty to a particular client. That creates unbelievable problems, right? If you do not have their authority to have your other clients and your other agents. Especially if you end up with two buyers for one property, or multiple offers, or all kinds of complex situations occur, and all of a sudden your duties are really complicated, right? This eliminates that entirely. It makes it very clear that the client has authorized you to have agency relationships with other buyers or sellers, or to have offers that you're presenting with other buyers and not have to share the information with the other client. I mean, we all know that we have a duty of full disclosure and complete honesty with our client. How can we do that if we have two buyers that are competing against each other on one property? So it creates all kinds of problems. So the reason I point this out is just to explain how valuable and important the buyer agency contract is. Forget the commission. I mean, if the commission would be great, protect yourself with commission, but if you don't have the courage to do that, then at very least get it signed for this reason. Now, having said that, there's one other form, and you'll see why I'm talking about this as I get into it a little bit. There is a form on your web forms that you should at least have, even if you don't have the courage to get a buyer agency contract signed by your buyers. And this form was created purposely to cover those three things which I just talked about. So at very least, you should have this form signed off web forms by every single buyer you deal with, so that you have no problem with at least those three items. Okay? I would prefer you use the buyer agency contract. You'll see why even more in a moment. But at least do this one, so that those authorities are granted to you and you're covered, and you don't have to worry about them coming back and saying you didn't look after their interests, or you were contrary to your fiduciary duties. And believe me, lawyers understand these things. So the moment they want to sue somebody, or the moment they want to go after somebody, what are they going to do? They're going to go after the lawyer, after the realtor. Why? Because you're the one with all the money, right? So they're going to go after that source. And so you want to make sure you have the coverage. So that's a point that I wanted to stress at the very beginning. You back up here. You'll find that on your web forms, and I'm going to show you a couple more in a moment. Now, moving forward towards the subject that we were talking about. In the Code of Ethics and the Standards of Business Practice, Article 20, you will find an explanation as to how commissions, if they're not what you've agreed on or what you want, how they are to be handled in that transaction. In other words, how do I negotiate commission and do it correctly? Article 20 is the guide. So if you take for a moment and you look at Article 20, and I've copied it in your handout, it talks about contractual relationships. The agency and other contractual relationships shall be respected, etc. But as you go down into the interpretations, let's look at 20.1. But if you want to look at it in here just for a second, I will show you the one that applies everywhere else in Canada except BC. The original 20.1 is printed out for you, the one that's not in the gray box. And it says, a realtor, when negotiating on behalf of a buyer, shall not use the terms of an offer to purchase to modify the listing broker's offer of compensation to the cooperating agency and so forth. So 20.1 says you will not use the contract to negotiate commission. Essentially what it's saying is nobody in Canada outside of BC can in fact renegotiate what is being offered from the seller through the listing agency as the cooperating broker's